It's Wednesday, October 14th, 2015, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are Missouri School of Journalism colleagues Reuben Stern and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, Playboy announces it's dropping nude photos from the pages of its magazine. The NFL claims copyright and gets Twitter to shut down the accounts of several sports websites posting GIFs of game highlights. And the first Democratic debate, it's come and gone. We'll talk about what went down last night in Las Vegas. There's a lot more that we'll hopefully get to as well, but we'll start with a word out of Iran of a guilty verdict for Jason Rezaian. It's the latest move in what has been a maddening process for Rezaian, his family, and journalists here and abroad. Word of the conviction came down on Iranian TV on Sunday, but details are still rather scant. Here's Wolf Blitzer talking to Rezaian's brother, Ali.
How much, first of all, are you learning about this conviction itself and the sentencing by Iran's revolutionary court?
You know, we really don't have much more information. We asked Jason's lawyer to go out and talk to the judge, and they rejected giving her any information about the verdict. So right now we're still waiting. They made some claims that they needed to have a translator present in order to pass on the judgment. But right now we're still waiting, and just it's very similar to what we've been doing the last 6 months.
So we don't know exactly what crime Jason Rezaian is supposedly guilty of. We don't know how long he'll be in prison. What do we know? That he has now a little bit fewer than 20 days to appeal. And it appears, according to some reporting, there might be some negotiations going on here for a prisoner swap, that this might be a pawn and a move for that.
I think this is a good reminder of the risk that journalists undertake when they go into countries that don't have the same rule of law as the U.S. and the rest of the West. So, you know, this idea of a closed and private trial, no public evidence released, family members showing up to get information, and there's no record of the court proceedings that they can get to. I mean, it's a really risky thing for journalists to be reporting from these areas.
And I think in terms of whether or not there's a prisoner swap, I mean, a lot of this is playing out on the nuclear talks and the treaty that both we're considering and they're considering. So whether or not that goes through as planned will have a big impact on whether or not he stays in prison or whether or not he's part of some sort of prisoner swap and that sort of thing. And it all goes back to the economic sanctions that were placed on Iran after the United States said, you know, you're not abiding by the previous agreements that were made back when they were actually open and allowing for nuclear inspections and that sort of thing.
So, Reuben, that kind of speaks to exactly what you were just saying, this idea of it being not necessarily, I don't want to say unsafe, but a very risky proposition when you do, as a journalist in the West, go into another country that perhaps your home country doesn't have the warmest relationship with.
Right. You know, I say tomato, you say tomato, I say reporting, you say espionage. You know, if that, in fact, is what they are holding him for, supposed espionage, you know, then that is really problematic in the case of journalists, because what we do is to go in and get information out of these countries. And some of what's been suggested is, you know, that he has been detained and gone through this whole thing because he was getting information that came back to the United States and caused companies that are in Iran to be, you know, to be held liable for violating sanctions and things like that. So that idea of information flowing out of the country and back to the rest of the world, you know, that's journalism. And yet, obviously, a regime like the one running Iran can, you know, hold that against the person doing it.
But, you know, I also think that this is Iran and other countries have done this before. They're sending a message basically saying we're going to control what information comes in and out, and we will allow you to have access, but only if you do these certain things. And if you don't do those things, then you're going to be subject to our judicial system in the way in which we handle the flow of information and that sort of thing. And so journalists are, when they go into those situations, they're probably told one thing, but then once they get there, it's something else. So I think we have to, when I say we, I'm talking about journalists, Western journalists have to be careful about how they approach covering news and information in these countries, and also understand that some of the protections that they have here don't necessarily work there, and whether or not their home government is going to be able to help them once they get in is
Help
also a
protect
huge thing.
or extract them in a situation
Exactly.
like this. Well, last night, the 5 declared candidates for the Democratic nomination for president met in Las Vegas for their first debate. Poised in the center, Hillary Clinton, flanked by Bernie Sanders, and then Martin Chafee and O'Malley. They sparred over gun control, foreign policy, Planned Parenthood, and what may or may not make each other electable. You know, there was Sanders' comments about not being a capitalist, and Hillary Clinton's emails. She apologized again and said she'd be testifying before what she called a partisan congressional committee. And she suggested that maybe it's time for all of us to move on. Apparently, she isn't the only one who thinks maybe it's time we do.
Let me say something that may not be great politics, but I think the Secretary is right. And that is that the American people are sick and tired of hearing about your damn emails.
Thank you. Me too. Me too.
You know? The middle class, Anderson, and let me say something about the media as well. I go around the country, talk to a whole lot of people. Middle class of this country is collapsing. We have 27 million people living in poverty. We have massive wealth and income inequality. Our trade policies have cost us millions of decent jobs. The American people want to know whether we're going to have a democracy or an oligarchy as a result of Citizens United. Enough of the emails. Let's talk about the real issues facing America.
So we all did watch the debate last night. We heard that clip there being one of the big highlights, one of the big headlines that came out of it. Thoughts about what you saw last night?
On that particular point, it raises a really good question, which tons of media scholarship has looked at, which is who sets the agenda for what the media are going to cover, right? Who decides? Because it's hard. If you're covering Washington and there are, hearings coming out and news coming out and people leaking turn-of-the-screw developments over this inquiry into her emails, as a reporter in Washington, you have a duty to report the latest bit of information about that. And yet that may not align with what people actually want to be reading about every day. So it really is a tough balancing act there. But I think Bernie Sanders nailed it. I think people are tired of this issue. I think combined with Hillary Clinton's assertions and some of the reporting that's come out that there is a partisan bent to a lot of what's going on there, there probably are better things for us to shine the light on.
And I think when it comes to the emails, it's been partisan from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And I think Bernie Sanders is right, and he's not the only one. There have been other candidates, even some on the Republican side, who have said, enough with the emails, because it just seems to be petty. And the public is looking at it that way, especially when you've got so many other issues out there that they're concerned about.
And Bernie Sanders had that laundry list, and he was right about every single one of them he brought up.
He's absolutely right. And the fact that this campaign has started so early and it started out so nasty is turning a lot of people off to even paying attention to it. So when you start seeing these polls about who's leading and whether or not Joe Biden is going to get into the race and that sort of thing, people are going like, whoa, wait a minute. We're not really you guys are in the season. We're not necessarily in the season yet. So, a lot of it is media driven right now.
You bring up Joe Biden and it being media driven. Kind of get the sense CNN was really disappointed he didn't make that last pitch effort, that last moment, I'm going to join in. They had a podium ready to go for him. They made a whole day about talking about the podium.
Yeah, I think CNN was a little concerned about that. But I think once the debate started, mm-hmm. and once they got through it and they start seeing what people were saying about it, I think at this point they're pretty pleased that, hey, we actually had a debate that dealt with issues and moved away from the pettiness of the emails and whether or not Joe Biden is going to get in the race and that sort of thing. We actually talked about some substantive issues. So I think in that regard, CNN won out in the end.
I agree with that, but I wouldn't call it a debate. I think what we saw last night was a group interview with tough questions aimed at each of the individual candidates, because they weren't really given an opportunity to go after each other and to sort of flush out the various ways to view these things. Instead, Anderson Cooper and his producers, and I emphasize, and his team of producers, did a lot of homework and came up with a lot of really good questions that put each one of those candidates on the spot for something specific.
Yeah, I think what they were trying to do was to have a program that was different from what we saw with the Republicans. And I think that they were successful in doing that.
Yeah, and this gets me to a point that I love to talk about with things like this too, is, it's a fine balance between what makes for good television and what is going to inform the American public. And the ideal scenario is that our news organizations aim for that sweet spot right between and maybe err toward the informing part. Sometimes it goes way off into the entertainment part, and I feel like the Republicans' debate tended to go that direction and was much more reality television. But this one felt very much like a game show. Like at any moment, I was expecting Anderson Cooper to say, is that your final answer? Or, would you like to ask the audience? Or, any number of those things. And in fact, in social media, people were superimposing. I saw an image of the candidates superimposed on the set of Jeopardy because the whole thing had this sort of game show feel to it on top of it. But there was substantive stuff discussed during the conversation, which is a credit to those producers and to Anderson Cooper.
And I think one of the things that you saw here was these were seasoned politicians who understand how to present their case to the American public in these types of formats. With the Republicans, you had, for lack of a better term, you had the Trump card.
You have executives,
Right.
you have reality TV stars, business and real estate moguls, you have a neuroscientist,
Right.
not people who have been front and center in that public service role in positions where they had been elected in the past. Another thing, Reuben, you're talking about how this was produced for television in a way that seemed very tightly done. Something you and I had been talking about earlier today, something we both noticed, that certain questions were posed by certain people on the CNN team throughout the debate.
It doesn't take a media scholar to
we
notice
were,
this.
It's not
I
like we
saw
were the
this
only two people
in
who
social
noticed
media.
this.
The reporters who asked the questions, African-American reporter Don Lemon asked the question about Black Lives Matter. Latino reporter Juan Carlos Lopez asked about immigration. The female reporter asked about family leave. So it was maybe, they asked each reporter to pick questions that mattered to them. That's possible. And even if that's what they did, it looks a lot like, they're pigeonholing people into asking about certain things. It just looks weird.
Yeah, I kind of noticed that a little bit too. And I didn't watch the full debate. I sort of watched it in segments, and I noticed that, and I was like, well, as somewhat of a media scholar, I'm looking at that and I'm going like, okay, you got the black person asking the black question, the woman asking the woman question. And I'm going like, this just seemed too staged. And maybe they should have really rethought that.
The optics, not so good there.
The optics weren't good, and how it was framed and how it came out. That, I think, was probably the one area in which CNN dropped the ball, shall we say.
Yeah, well, there's another one, too. They didn't bring Jake Tapper into it. So their chief White House correspondent was nowhere to be seen last night. And I'm not the only person to have brought this up, to give credit to others who spotted this well before the debate actually happened. But yeah, I just remember, Candy Crowley being the one to moderate the debate in the past, where you've got this person who, is not as made for television as Anderson Cooper, let's say, but who had a deep knowledge of these issues, who was sitting in the chair at the base of the stage, not standing in the round in the middle of a casino facility, having this kind of a conversation that was a little more, traditionally political as opposed to television ready.
I'm going to be really interested to see what happens once we get past this whole debate season into the primaries, and then once we get the nominees, to see where the debate goes. My guess is that it's going to go back to the more traditional kind of debate setting and debate format where you do get to some substantive issues.
Can I throw out two quick things also that are interesting? One is the irony of Bernie Sanders standing on a stage calling out Wall Street as legalized gambling while they're in a resort casino in Las Vegas, while the the commercial breaks are showing ads from Chase Bank and the New York Stock Exchange. I just found that really, really funny as a media moment. And then the last thing, I'll credit Jeff Jarvis, who's a media scholar in New York, with this is, he pointed out the irony of Anderson Cooper asking Hillary Clinton if she as a 1%er could represent the rest of the American public, when Anderson Cooper himself is more of a 1%er than Hillary is. Just a nice piece of irony there too.
Gloria Vanderbilt.
Right, exactly.
Our next topic is one that's bound to make some hardcore old school journalists feel a little icky. Now that interest in the 2016 campaign is really starting to build, BuzzFeed has found another avenue to build revenue around it. It's going to start producing native advertising on behalf of candidates and causes central to the election. This isn't the first time that BuzzFeed has kind of dipped a toe into the advertorial pool, if you will.
Go ahead, Ernest.
Part of the thing that sort of drives me nuts about this is that we're sort of moving. We've been moving in this direction for a while. So to be honest, I'm not surprised that it's going to happen in this election cycle, and that BuzzFeed is the one that's sort of leading the way. But what it really comes down to is that we really need to think about media literacy, and it needs to become a core part of our educational system, so that people truly understand the difference between these native ads and how they fit into the content that they're reading and they're viewing and they're looking at.
And that maybe the word sponsored by or presented by or whatever that by might be maybe isn't completely clear to the audience.
I don't think it's really as clear, definitely not as clear as it needs to be.
I agree, and I'll tell you why this matters. It matters in the context of BuzzFeed specifically, because BuzzFeed has built its entire business model on this. Like, their value proposition is not, we're going to sell traditional advertising. Their value is they are becoming the organization that can get messages out in front of eyeballs better than anyone else. And that is from their founding. I mean, BuzzFeed began, let's remember, as an experiment in how things go viral and how to make them go viral. And so that is their core DNA, is how do we get messages out there? And they've shifted into what they call distributed content, which is specifically, content that moves out through all these social channels without even living on the BuzzFeed website. And other news organizations are following right behind. So this business model is going to be the future of media in some capacity. So it is important we get people literate about it.
And the other part to that is that what can happen and has happened, and you can look at this throughout history, is at some point they're going to find themselves in an ethical quandary, because people don't really understand the difference between whether or not this is a part of the story or is this somewhat separate from the story, because that line there between the advertorial and the editorial is so narrow. And I think this is where BuzzFeed really needs to not just BuzzFeed, but everyone needs to figure out, how do we show that differentiation in a way that people truly understand it.
Yeah, I think it's also important that news organizations get a little less skittish about calling each other out as well. I mean, it happens sometimes, but there's a lot less of that than we probably need to see.
But that's a competition thing, and that's if I can bring them down, and it raises me up, and that's going to be very hard for them not to fall into that trap.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, so we have a new associate producer who's working with us this week, and she and I were having a conversation about what types of stories we talk about and what we shy away from. And her first question for me was, would we be willing to talk about the Playboy story? And I think she was pretty taken aback when I told her we would definitely be talking about the Playboy story. If you haven't heard yet, Playboy is moving away from the nude photos in the centerfold that has defined it, going all the way back to its 1953 debut. Why? Well, it's because its CEO says the internet has kind of made it seem antiquated.
It's not provocative to see nudity, and in fact, it can actually limit our audience.
So maybe Playboy is about the articles then?
It has always been about the articles.
Right. It's always been about the articles.
The quote I love from the company's CEO, Scott Flanders, is, "You're now one click away from every sex act imaginable for free, so it's just passé at this juncture."
And that pretty much puts it out there. But what is Playboy going to need to do then to remain competitive with publications like Rolling Stone, like Vanity Fair, like Vice?
Well, I think if you go back and you look at Playboy, they've always had...
I'll be honest, I don't read the articles. I don't look at Playboy. I've never looked at Playboy.
I will be honest.
Okay.
I've read the articles. I've seen the photos. I'll be transparent about that. They have a history of doing very good investigative journalism. They have a history of doing very good profiles on people that sort of move the needle. And I think if they can continue to do that, or get back to doing that at the level that they were doing it in the 1960s and 1970s and even on into the 80s, I think that they're going to have a place in the marketplace of this type of journalism. But they also need to understand that everything is so segmented now with on the web and in the way in which Vice and others have gone, that they're going to have to sort of go back and find that niche that they once had, and maybe expand on that in a certain way and market it in a way that they aren't doing right now.
Now, we
the
should
marketing
note the photos,
is the key.
Well, we should note the photos aren't going away entirely.
Right.
Just the completely nude photos.
Yeah, they're going to look like
away.
Esquire's photos is what's going to happen. I mean, Esquire runs a lot of pinup type photos, but you don't see the actual sort of parts that would not be allowed on television. But I think the marketing part is really important. It reminds me of Oldsmobile. A mark that like was your father's Oldsmobile. Like I think of Playboy as a magazine my father subscribed to, and he did. I mean, there was a drawer of them in his bedroom and whatever. We didn't look at them, but we knew they were there. But I mean, I think that's the biggest challenge is to get this idea that this magazine is still relevant to a new generation, and I think that's what they're trying to do. But they are going to have to define themselves in some way that not only is relevant to this generation, but also sets them apart from these other high-quality magazines that are already out there doing very similar things.
So when we're talking about relevant to a new generation, we've often talked about how tightly the NFL holds on to its copyright on game highlights. Well, we saw it enter a new realm this week. Twitter suspended accounts belonging to Deadspin for tweeting out GIFs of Sunday's games. Reuben, help me explain to our audience who may not fully understand what a GIF is.
This is funny because we just pushed out a show about GIF files today, actually. So a GIF file is like a hybrid between a photograph and a video. So it's a much smaller file format, and they're popular now. They actually came out in the 80s and then became animated in the 90s because of browser technology. But they're popular now because it's really easy to share them via social media. And so now young people are replying to each other using animated GIF files to communicate an emotional response of some kind rather than just typing in a word. So they're highly relevant in that way, but they can give you a little bit of a video segment through a series of still images in the course of a couple of seconds.
And the NFL is saying this is a violation of their copyright, that you can't use video that shows highlights, especially during a game.
Well, this is classic NFL. They will do whatever it takes to protect the shield. And those videos, no matter how short, how small they are, they feel is a copyright infringement of an NFL game or any NFL production, and they have the right to stop that by any means necessary. So it doesn't surprise me that they've gone after this.
So speaking of the big money that's around professional football, baseball, basketball, hockey, the New York Times ran an interesting piece last week about some of the fantasy sites like DraftKings and FanDuel.
FanDuel's one-day leagues for real money are the hottest thing in fantasy baseball.
On FanDuel, I've won over $62,000.
Fantasy baseball on FanDuel is easy. Just choose a league, pick your team, and get your cash winnings the next day.
There's $1 games, there's $2 games.
So let me correct myself there. It's actually DraftKings, not DraftKings. The best way to describe these sites, they're basically platforms in which people can pay to play fantasy football, baseball, whatever it might be, against strangers. Usually you end up paying anywhere between 25 cents and up to $1,000 to get into the game. Ernest, tell us a little bit more about what's going on here.
Well, really what's going on is this is and you have sponsorship. I mean, even individual NFL teams and owners are part of this. What basically happened is this is a fantasy football, which actually started out, guys getting together and having drafts and that sort of thing, and you're pooling your money, and now it's become a multi-billion-dollar business, and you have all these investors going in. Well, what's happened is you have these two basic companies. You have DraftKings and FanDuel, and they're going at each other, and they are actually sponsoring on various NFL shows on ESPN, on Fox Sports, basically all over the place, to the point where people are going, well, wait a minute, is this gambling or is this not? And you're actually going to probably see sometime in the next congressional hearings looking at this, because there are people going, wait a minute, this is pretty close to gambling, and there's a lot of money involved. But then how can we not regulate this but regulate all these other forms of all the sports books and all that? So this is going to be very huge, and one of the things you're going to see is a lot of lobbying on the part of the NFL, Major League Baseball, the NBA, because they have invested in these heavily, both in terms of the advertising that they're getting from them as well as their sponsorship of these sites in particular.
So on the heels of the New York Times story last week, ESPN said it was banning its sponsorship of these segments by DraftKings and FanDuel, and within 3 days lifted that ban.
Because there's a lot of money involved. And basically what happened was you had employees from one company using their expertise and what they knew about how the system worked to win money on the other site. And now it
was almost being considered like insider trading type of situation.
Yeah, and that's what brought Congress into this, and congressmen saying, wait a minute, we need to look at this. And then you have these companies banning their employees from being engaged not only on their own site but also on the other site. And so people are saying, well, maybe that quieted it down, and so you have the 3 days and then they're back up because there's so much money involved right now.
It's going to be one that we're going to watch, and I think we're going to end up talking about it a lot more over the course of the coming weeks and months. Finally, before we go today, I want to ask both of you about a conviction of a former Reuters editor, Matthew Keyes. He was found guilty last week of aiding Anonymous in hacking the Los Angeles Times. There was some surprise when that verdict was announced, not that Keyes was found guilty, but that the charges he was found guilty of could carry a 25-year prison sentence. NSA leaker Edward Snowden tweeted about it. For defacing an LA Times article for 40 minutes, journo Matthew Keyes faces 25 years, #prison policy. The likelihood that he's going to actually get 25 years is pretty low, but it does raise some interesting questions about how the government is going after journalists.
I think one of the keys here is that, journalists using hackers to gain access into someone else's.
I mean, this was a disgruntled ex-employee. What he did is not right by any stretch of the imagination. We're not endorsing that part. We're not talking about that part. It's the idea of maybe that the government is trying to send a message.
I think they're trying to send a message to hackers. And if they can use journalists to do that, that's fine. And they're concerned about whether or not there's going to be this sort of collaboration between hackers and journalists, and then using the First Amendment as a way to shield themselves. That's my own interpretation of it. I think they're being a little harsh in the way in which they're doing it. I think they could have actually sat down and maybe come up with some sort of a compromise here. I don't think he's going to get to 25 years, but
some are saying it's likely to be closer to 7.
Yeah, something
so.
like that. But the disgruntled part is what opened the door for the government to use this as a tactic.
Kind of a maliciousness. I mean, there's a different motivation that drove Edward Snowden, which was the idea that he was helping the world at large. I mean, it doesn't change the fact that he ported documents out of a building that he was not authorized to give to somebody else, and that is the sticking point on his. So it becomes an ethical conversation of, does the end justify the means here and mitigate the amount of retribution that should happen to the person for doing what they did? So I think that's a key differentiator there.
Yeah, but I think the other part, too, is that you are talking about a disgruntled employee who was working in the media, who found another job in the media, and then all of a sudden said, well, I want to get back at the company that did this to me, and I can do that by using Anonymous. And so it's one of those things where it's going to be tough for other media to come to this person's defense, because they're going like, wait a minute, but you're a part of us, and you were disgruntled.
And it's interesting because at the very beginning and at the time of the indictment, there were a lot of people who did. And then as this verdict came down last week,
and the details.
Right. And opinions among others in the journalism community have shifted.
And there's a lot of moving around in the journalism world, too. So, I mean, there are a lot of news organizations that have lots and lots of former employees out there, and we trust that they're going to do the right thing and hope that they do. Okay, well, that music means we're pretty much out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about the topics we talked about today on our links blog. It's under the Programs tab at KBIA.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, leave us comments, questions, see what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, along with Maya Jackson and Pat Akers for handling the audio. Sue Lee is our associate producer. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.